I'm Dan Poblocki. You are listening to Our First Fears, a podcast about gateway horror, past and present, with creators currently working in the genre. When today's guest, author Ally Malinenko, told me that The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe was one of her first fears, I had no idea of the twisting chambers into which I'd be heading when I began rereading Poe's work. Doors were opened in my mind, some of which I thought I'd locked up tight. The Telltale Heart is one of Poe's short stories first published in 1843, and it reveals the workings of the fragile mind of a mysterious narrator whose obsession with an elderly companion's unusual eyeball leads to murder and dismemberment. Wild stuff for the mid-19th century. But then, there's a reason why we still read him. This is such a cool conversation, and not merely because Ally bravely answered and then met my call to get really, really personal here. We talk about how Poe's seemingly unbearable grief led to his writing about anxiety and depression, and how we both sorta relate to that. Ally and I gab about how horror literature belongs in classrooms, how to get past the idea that reading scary classics is a chore, how this particular genre is imperative for some young readers, and how we will fight you about this if you disagree. Ally Malinenko is the Stoker-nominated author of This Appearing House, available now in a lovely paperback edition. Her first book, Ghost Girl, came out in 2021, and she has more stories on the way, some of them as creepy as her previous work, and some less so, but we won't hold that against her. The content warnings are now in the show notes, so if you like, check those out before listening. Now, turn down the lights, turn up the volume, and get ready to explore Our First Fears. Hi, Ally.
Hi, Dan.
I'm so happy to see your face and get to talk to you today about Our First Fears.
Me too. I can't wait.
Yeah. So let's just jump right into this because I have a lot of questions for you, and I feel like we could go all over the place. But first, could you tell our listeners who you are, what kind of work you do, and your relationship to the horror genre?
Sure. So my name is Ally Malinenko, and I am a middle grade author currently of two books. The first one is Ghost Girl, and the second one is This Appearing House. And they're both horror books, and I am a very big horror fan and always have been because I feel... Aside from the fact that I feel like horror really gets into the heart of what it is to be human, let alone what it is to possibly be monstrous, I feel like it's the best way that we talk about empathy. And I feel like it's a lot of fun. And I think kids should have horror in their lives, which is a weird thing to say sometimes.
No, I
really
100% agree with you. Like it's actually my mission.
Right. Exactly. I mean, having read your stories, you are succeeding.
Well, I've been quoting you a lot because you had tweeted something sometime over the summer, maybe it was earlier than that, about we don't write horror to scare children, to scare kids, but we write horror to help make kids feel brave.
Yes. And just to show them how brave they are. Because they make it through the night. They get through our stories and they're like, I did it. I mean, it's an amazing thing. And
I think that's a brilliant way to put it. And I'm probably going to be quoting you for the rest of my life on that. So
go for it. I sure don't. I'm definitely not the only person to have said it. So,
well,
I think
you said it good.
Hey, well, for as long as Twitter lives, I'll at least have that.
Right. So the second question I want to ask you is, do you remember the first time you ever felt frightened?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this because I'm a big fan of your podcast, and I was thinking about this question, and I was like, well, I'm sure that I felt frightened by something outside that frightened me, something in the world that frightened me. But the first time I remember sort of conjuring up my own fears would have been when I was probably, I want to guess like 6 or 7. So pretty young. I mean, not too young because my memory is not great, but I remember being about that age and having a reoccurring nightmare about this tall, extremely thin man who would get into my house, and I would lock myself in the bathroom. Now, the bathroom in my house really didn't actually have a lock, but in my dream it always did. And I would lock myself in the bathroom, and somehow, and I think this is the part that scared me the most because it didn't make sense, as dreams often don't.
Mm-hmm.
But somehow he could fit his hand through the crack in the door and open the knob so that like it didn't matter that it was locked because he could still get in. And he had like no eyes. It was just, I mean, and it was reoccurring. It's the only time in my life that I really can think of until I became an adult and had like adult anxiety. But it was the only time in my life as a kid where I had this nightmare repeatedly. And it was always exactly the same thing. Like it never varied. I never like went anywhere but into the bathroom. I never like got him to not open the door. He opened the door and would stand in the doorway and I would wake up then. Like it's not like he murdered me or anything, but like it was just this constant threat. And I'm kind of convinced that like this dream is the cause of my what has now been a lifelong fear of home invasion. And I think it stems from this because I have no other experience with like home invasion issues. I've never had that happen, thank God. But I'm one of those people that like both seeks out and fears the stories that you read sometimes where like people move into a new apartment and like behind the bathroom mirror, like it leads to a whole nother other apartment.
Me too.
Right? Like it terrifies me. And I have to like watch those videos and then also simultaneously be horrified. And then whenever I come home alone, I'm like, is it possible that someone's like hiding out here and I don't know?
Have you ever had to go through your whole house?
I literally have. I've literally it's gotten so bad. Like my anxiety has gotten so bad that I'm like, okay, well, we're just going to open every door. We're going to open every door and make sure there's no one hiding anywhere. And then you feel ridiculous afterwards because like, of course, but also like, what if? What if we didn't check?
Yeah. I mean, some people have not checked and then paid the price.
Exactly. You see those videos where like all of a sudden like some woman comes crawling out of a cabinet and raiding someone's fridge in the middle of the night. You're like, she's just going to crawl back in that cabinet and be there all day.
I mean, if that's all she wants, you know what? She can have it.
Like, honestly, she can have the whole place at this point. I will just cede my apartment to whoever's living in the walls because I'll never get over it. So, that's it. I'm going to move. It's yours now.
Oh my God. That's amazing.
Enjoy your new home.
So speaking of paranoia, right?
Sure.
This is a good segue to talk about the fear that you mentioned that you wanted to talk about, which was The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, which is a classic of paranoia, of unreliable narrator, which I feel
my
like
first
comes along with the, with that whole genre. Can you tell us how you first encountered The Telltale Heart?
I sure can. How my teachers traumatized me. So I feel like it was third grade. Okay, so I grew up in the Hudson Valley, and my school was weird. Like it was a bit of a hippie school. There were no walls. So like it was just cabinets that divided classroom spaces, which was great because when you went up to like sharpen your pencil, you could like wave to your best friend in another classroom. But it also required like a deep level of concentration that I think a lot of kids didn't have to worry about because you could hear everything else that other teachers were saying. You could hear the other kids answering questions. So it was it was like hyper focused on whatever your classroom was. And one day in either second or third grade, I feel like it was third based upon where I recall my classroom being in the like floor space. They took all of us, all of the third graders, into the auditorium at the center of the building. Now, this auditorium was referred to as the pit, which is weirdly spooky. And I don't know who created that, but that's what it's called. And it was it wasn't like an auditorium with like seats and a stage, it wasn't like a theater auditorium. It was called the pit, I guess, because it was like bleacher like seatings that just descended, and there were no windows, and everybody sat in these on these little like bleachers, and they turned off the lights, so we were in the pitch black, and they played the audio version of The Telltale Heart. And that story's not very long. I know that. I know factually that story couldn't have taken more than 20 minutes. But in my memory and in my head, I was in that room for days, just days and days of listening to this terrifying story. And it ends, as I think many of the audios do, with a heartbeat. And to this day, if you put that in a horror movie, it will drive me out of the room. Like I cannot stand the sound of a beating heart. Yeah. It just, and I can only assume it's from that, because that was the first time I really, like, I was in third grade. I wasn't really digging into that much horror. Mm-hmm. And that was, I believe, like, at least to my memory, the first time, like, I remember that sensation of like sitting in the dark, listening to this creepy narrator tell this thoroughly gruesome tale of violence, and it ending with like the thumping of a heart. And I was like, that's it. I'm destroyed.
Yeah.
So that's First Fears. There it is.
Okay. So before we get into anything further, can you synopsize The Telltale Heart for our listeners?
Sure. Okay. So The Telltale Heart is a short story by Poe in which it starts. It's amazing the way it starts, because like the first word in the story is true. And it's like as if it's in response. So you're starting right in the middle of a conversation. You don't know who the narrator is, and you don't know who they're talking to. A lot of people assume it is maybe the police or psychiatrist or doctor. But what they do is then the narrator tells the story about why they're not mad, but they had to murder this old man that lived with them because he had a quote unquote vulture eye. That's what he calls it. Like, he couldn't live with this man's like one squeaky eye. Mm-hmm. So he had to murder him. And he talks about how like the man never did anything bad to him. And this also is why it like shook me as a kid, because it was like, it's so senseless. The man was he was a nice old man, but he couldn't live with him having this disgusting eye. So each night, the narrator would crack open the door and bring a lantern into the room, slowly build up so that he could get closer and closer and closer to the man. So he would do it each night. And I think, again, really feels like it ties into like some home invasion stuff for me. This is great. This is like therapy. So, he creeps in the door, and then like he gets closer and closer, and then he'll leave. And then the next night he gets closer and closer, and then he'll leave. And then on the one night when the man opens and he sees the vulture eye, he brings him to attack, and he attacks him and he kills him. And then he tells the story very weirdly calmly about how he dismembered his entire body in the bathtub, and he buried the man's heart underneath the floorboards of the bedroom. And because he shrieked, understandably, before he was murdered, the neighbors call the police, and the police come. And he sets out the narrator, the unknown narrator, who's just murdered this man, and he's cleaned everything up before the police get there. He sets out chairs for the policemen right over the floor, right on the floor, right over where he's buried the old man's heart. And he starts to hear it beating. And he's convinced that the police can hear it too. And they're just like messing with him. They're just like, nope, we'll pretend we're not hearing this, even though we all are, and we know what you did. And the narrator flips out and confesses and tears up the floorboards and is like, there, I did it. I murdered him. Like, you got me. And that's basically The Telltale Heart.
Yeah. I mean, that was perfect. It's funny to hear you mention your first experience with this as an audio story that you listened to, and it sounded like you had been listening to it for days.
Yeah.
Because my first experience with the story was in 7th grade.
That feels like a much more reasonable age than 3rd.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was an appropriate time for the introduction to this story. I remember liking it, but I also remember it being like long. I remember it being like a novella. And having gone back and reread the story in the edition that I have, it is 5 pages
Yeah,
long.
it's
It is
super short.
one of the shortest stories I've
Yep.
ever read.
Yes. And it doesn't feel that way though. And I don't know if it's like the audio aspect or it was just like we didn't know what to expect. It just,
Mhm.
I felt like I was in that room listening to this man tell this horrifying story for forever.
I want to ask you, in terms of childhood versus adulthood, experiencing the story back then versus revisiting it now, what is the discrepancy between the length of time as a child coming to this story and what we can probably sit down and devour in 15, 20 minutes as an adult? I mean, I know mental perception between childhood and adulthood is, clearly different. But I mean,
Yeah,
the experience with this story kind of seems extreme to me.
I feel like for me it was also because it was the first time I had any experience with like the notion of an unreliable narrator. So
Mm,
that kind of just like changes things because it's like you're listening to someone tell you the story, but also it doesn't really make a lot of sense and they're trying to convince you that there's nothing wrong with them, and yet they just cold-blooded murdered this man because he had a vulture eye. And it's like I feel like that is just very jarring. Like I'm used to an unreliable narrator now. Like I'm like, oh, okay, we're doing unreliable narrators. That's fine. It's like fun. It's like a fun thing that now when it comes up, I'm like, ooh, should I believe you or not?
mhm.
But I feel like back then I didn't know to not trust.
Mhm.
And I feel
You
like
you you take it at face
disorients
value.
you. Right. You
Yeah.
take it at face value. And then all of a sudden it doesn't make sense. And I feel like that could add to this notion of like, because you're just disoriented at that point.
Mhm.
So, like,
Mhm.
that might add to this idea that it's lasting a very long time because while you're listening, you're also like, what is happening?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, and also like you said, like your perception of time when you're younger is completely different. Like your brain
Yeah.
does so much work of like remembering experiences when you're younger that everything seems to take longer. Remember how long
Oh,
summer
for
felt?
sure.
Like when
Oh,
you
yeah.
weren't in school, it was like a whole year went
Decades.
by. Yeah. Yeah. And now it's like just 2 disgusting hot months and I hate
Yeah.
it.
Hate it. I'm with you. But unreliable narrators, I don't think as a seventh grader and probably as a third grader, you probably relate to this as well. I didn't know that you could write a story that would do that. So
Yes.
when I say I took things at face value, as a kid, the reason I was interested in this story, I think, was because maybe there was a beating heart under the floor.
Yes.
And like that supernatural aspect to it, I was like, oh my gosh, the guy's ghost is still alive, or blah,
Right.
blah, blah.
Right.
Now, clearly, that's not the case in my own reading of it now.
Sure. It's just his guilt.
Yeah,
But as a
it's
kid, no,
very
I
no,
didn't like suss that out. Like that
no.
part could have been real. Anything could have been real at that point.
Hmm.
Like cuz
Hmm.
that's what happens when you first it's their first experience with someone who was like, I'm going to tell you a story and I might lie to you like this
Yeah,
whole time. I might be lying.
yeah.
I don't and you won't know. So, yeah.
Yeah, I do you think that I mean, I wrote a book in the past couple years that has an element of unreliable narrator. It's a ghost story called Liar's Room. And I wonder if it's too complicated a concept for the middle grade audience that I was writing for. Do you think a middle grade audience can understand the concept of an unreliable narrator? And maybe, if not, is this a question that an educator, a parent could have with a child, a conversation that an educator or parent can have with a child about truth versus fiction, of perception of reality versus actual reality? Is it a question worth raising with kids?
I mean, I think that an 11-year-old understands the concept. I mean, cuz okay, when you what you're talking about when you're talking about unreliable characters, you're talking about someone that might be lying to you. And, kids certainly lie to each other, and they lie to their parents, and they lie to their teachers. And I think that aspect of it is understandable. I think it's not the introduction of it in a work of fiction feels to me like it would be something that was very new. Like that, people lie to you, but would books lie to you? I feel like that's where it starts to get like, that's where, because I feel like I spent so much time as a kid never thinking about the author. I thought about the story. I liked the book. The cover was cool. The story was fun. Moving along. And I never considered the author. The first time I remember flipping over a book and looking at who wrote it was after I read A Wrinkle in Time. And that was specifically because Meg was the realest little girl I had ever read in my life. Meg was angry and insecure and all the things I felt, but never saw represented. And that was the moment where I was like, wow, someone did this. Like someone made this. Like her name is Madeline Liangle and she wrote this. And I think that's also the first time I was like, I wonder if this is something I could do. That was the first time I really started thinking about being a writer. So I feel like until you reach that point where you think of books as a thing that a human creates, so of course they can lie to you. But prior to that, ultimately, to answer your question, as I am now rambling, I ultimately think it is a concept that kids who read middle grade books can handle. But I do think it would probably often be an introduction to that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like it would be a new concept, which is fine. That's a good thing. But it would be something they would be like, oh, so a story can also lie to you. Like my friend lied to me and said that he couldn't go to the park, even though he just didn't want to. Like a story can also lie to me.
Oh, I remember the first time I caught my friend in a lie.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I remember, and I hope he's not listening to this.
Sure,
I'm not going to name names. I'm not going to name names. And I'm not going to say when it was, but I went over to a friend's house when I was a kid and knocked on the door, and it was summertime. And he came to the door and I was like, hey, do you want to hang out for a little while before lights out, before the street lights come on, back in the 80s? And he was like, let me go ask my mom if I can. And so I'm standing at the door and all the windows are open and I hear him upstairs in the bedroom talking to his mother.
Oh my God.
And I hear him say, Danny's downstairs and asked me if I want to play. And she said, well, do you? And he was like, not really. And I was like, and he came downstairs and he was like, my mom says that I can't, so sorry. And I walked home in shock. I was like, oh my gosh, does he not like me? And like, why wouldn't he just tell me that?
Yeah.
It was like a full revelation. I'm not going to say how old I was because I don't want to put a person on the spot. But you know who you are if you're listening.
You know you're out there.
And I still love you. I still love you. I still love you, friend. I still love you, friend. So yeah,
that's it. That's that moment where you're like, oh, they just made that up. They just blamed mom, but really they didn't want to hang out with me. Why didn't they want to hang out with me?
But also like discovering how an untruth can be used as a tool.
Yes.
That's also pretty major.
Because it's like, oh, can I do that too?
Yeah.
Can I also be like, mom said no. Sorry. Going back in my room to read.
I want to go back to the story and my own perception of what I read at the time. And this will sort of lead into something else. But I remember the story being mostly about the heart beating under the floorboards. And it's not. That moment comes maybe in a half page on the last page. And the way that I read it now was it's not even described as a heartbeat sound. It is a ringing in his ears first.
Yes.
Right? And that's what sort of starts the paranoia of, you know what I did? You're trying to make me confess. Tears up the floorboards and he screams, it's the beating of his hideous heart. And only in those last few words do you realize that the noise that he's been hearing is the heartbeat.
Right.
That's the way that I read it this time. Maybe I got it wrong. It made me think, my memory, my perception of what this story is, it is so ingrained. The story, The Telltale Heart, is so ingrained in our pop culture. There have been so many tellings of it in short film, in animation, in audiobooks, and being presented to school children in what is called a pit. I feel like we develop a kind of shorthand for classic works, especially works that are shared in schools. And in a way, they kind of get boiled down. Does this mean that these works sort of lose potency? And maybe is this a reason to revisit these kinds of works more frequently?
I think it's very important to expose kids to things like this in schools and to dismantle it and to talk about it and to learn from it. But in doing so, and it's kind of like the whole Shakespeare thing, in doing so, it becomes a chore and then it loses some of its magic. So I think in the same way that I'm a I'm a huge Shakespeare fan, but I'm also like of the variety of you need to see it performed to fully understand it. Shakespeare fan. Like if someone's
Agree.
like, I'm gonna read all of Shakespeare, I'm like, cool, okay, sure. Like enjoy. But if you really want to enjoy Shakespeare, go watch it be interpreted because it's in the interpretation that there you see how the magic still exists. And
Yeah.
I think stories that you are exposed to as a child for learning purposes, they're important and that's why you're being exposed to them. But like in the doing so, they become a lesson. It's homework. It's a chore. And I have tried really hard to revisit works that I had to read in from grade school through like even into college and revisit them as an adult and experience them for what they are outside of the pressure of interpretation and symbolism and all of the things that you have to like suss out of a story and just enjoy it for what it is. And I've found often, and I have one exception because I hated this book when I was a kid and I hate it as a grown up, and it's Silas Marner and it's so boring and I hate it.
Mm.
And it will never be good, in my opinion. Sorry to all the Silas Marner fans out there. I don't know who you are.
I
Yeah.
I feel like I might have been assigned Silas Marner in
Oh, God.
11th or 12th grade, and I can tell you the impact it had on me because I don't even know what that book is about.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Pretty sure I read it.
It's about like a very uninteresting man who winds up with a baby. And that's all I can tell you. That's all I remember.
Okay.
I just
Yeah.
absolutely, I was like, this is the most boring story I've ever read. And it continues to be that to this day. So I do think it's important to like revisit these. And I think especially something as fundamental as Poe, you
Mhm.
know, because he created so many works that are just canon, that are like tales that get told and retold and revamped. I think revisiting Poe is definitely always a good idea, especially if, like I said, for me, all of the Poe that I was exposed to when I was younger wasn't something like I went to the library and checked out Edgar Allan Poe. I was assigned Edgar Allan Poe,
Yes.
you
Yes.
know, so it was work. So I've
Same
definitely
thing.
enjoyed like coming back to it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
same thing with The Fall of the House of Usher. I
Yes.
thought it was a whole novel. I think I read it in 10th grade. It was assigned to us, American Studies class. Again, I think it's because his language is so poetic and dense, and he is fitting so much story and
Mm-hmm.
background
Yeah.
so economically
Yeah.
in a lot of ways into such a few number of pages, which I know was one of his rules as a writer, that it does feel longer. Going back to Telltale Heart, the background of who is this narrator? How did they end up living with this old man? Like there is a whole history that is not touched upon in the
Nope.
in the novel, in the short story, right?
In a very short
It's still
story.
in a very short story, but it does feel like there's a whole world behind it, and I think
Mm-hmm.
that is one of the magical skill sets of Poe. getting back into what you were just talking about, books being assigned in the classroom, and I want to talk about teaching horror in classrooms. I think that's a really interesting concept. As I was rereading this story, I was thinking about some of the other books that I didn't even recognize could have been considered horror when I was reading them. They were assigned to me for summer reading. And like you said, they felt like a chore in a way because I had to take time out of my lovely, summer vacation to sit and read a book. Oh, the horror. Now I'm like,
The thing I
that
would
sounds
beg
like
for.
a dream. But I remember being assigned Rebecca and Lord of the Flies. And those two, I think you could probably argue both of them have some horror elements to them if they
Oh,
are not straight up
absolutely.
horror in general.
I would say, well, I think Rebecca definitely is, and I think Lord of the Flies only doesn't get called horror because it's like it's got this weird, like it's classic literature vibe to it. But let's be honest, it's about a bunch of feral kids on an island who commit
Mhm.
murder. Like it's horror.
Yeah. And one of them speaking to a decapitated head of a pig,
Pig.
the Lord of the Flies. And
Yes.
what is the Lord of the Flies? It's the devil, right?
Yes. Yes.
Um, so the title of the book is referencing Satan, and and I am not making an argument or a case that this book should not be taught in schools. I think it should be. I think it's an important.
Yeah.
I would argue it's an important book. I know a lot of people are not fans of it, but I don't care. I will say the moment where Piggy gets killed was the first time, and I had read Stephen King prior to reading The Lord of the Flies. The
Mm-hmm.
moment where they drop the rock on Piggy's head and he dies it made me physically
Yes.
sick. I
Yes.
got ill and I had to
It's
stop
so
reading the book.
upsetting. It's so upsetting.
And I don't remember how my teachers talked to us about that book. I would love to go back and see a memory of us talking about what the Lord of the Flies was and the literature that we were experiencing and reading and studying. I would love to go back and see that
Yeah.
conversation.
I can't. I mean, I was also taught it in school, and I also have no recollection of how that murder was discussed after the fact, which feels kind of crazy to me because I obviously had to be. But I think, like you, it was so deeply upsetting. Like, I feel like my teacher probably talked about it and nobody said anything.
Yeah.
Like, everyone was just like really quiet.
You know what? I think that's important. We like to imagine that we must coddle our children. We can't show them the ways of the real world. And I think that's a big fear that is being tossed around in this country right now in terms of
Mm-hmm.
books. But it is an important conversation to have. I mean, children are dealing with death every day. They're dealing more and more with the fears of being attacked in a place
Mm-hmm.
of learning. Like,
Mm-hmm.
why can't we talk about, the murder of Piggy and the conch shell? Do you have anything else to say
Yeah,
about
I
this?
mean,
Or?
I guess the only thing I just wanted to add too is like this is a point that I often bring up whenever I'm talking about why it's important, why we should not deny access to horror when kids want to read it. And why the dangers of that level of gatekeeping is basically, I think the thing that people don't understand about horror, and I say this because like I had a really, can I just tell like a small little side story about like a
Yes, of
weird
course, please.
experience I had? So, okay, so when I got Ghost Girl, my first novel, accepted for publication, the announcement didn't come out for like 6 months because HarperCollins doesn't announce until the contract is inked and everything. And it just took a while. So I was like thrumming with the desire to tell people that like my dream had come true, and I couldn't for like 6 months. My day job, I worked as a librarian in an archive. And I had a researcher coming in, and I recognized her name because she was the author of a biography that I adored on one of my favorite writers. And I was so excited that she was there. And I told her what a fan I was. And in that small exchange, I was like, I'm not really, I can't talk about it online or anything, but, I just got my first book accepted. And she was so She was like, oh, what do you write? And I was like, well, it's middle grade horror. And she was like, I'm sorry? And I was like, yeah, like, like scary stories to tell in the dark, like horror for kids. And like her face just dropped. And she was like, I would never let my children read something like that. And I was like, oh, and that oh, okay, thank you. And I just gave her material and I was like, I'm at the reference desk if you need anything. And I just sat there like dumbfounded that this person thinks that the thing that I consider so important and so powerful and so necessary is dangerous somehow and should not be something that kids have access to. And I have just sort of made it my goal as a writer to continuously confront that level of gatekeeping and ask what we, the adults, are so afraid of, that we don't want kids. Because it's like, I think, we were on Neil's podcast together, and I think Laura,
Talking Scared.
So we were on Talking Scared, great podcast. And I think that was the podcast in which Laura Senf, author of The Clackety, great book, read it, brought up this idea that her kids have to go through lockdown, and there's nothing she could write that could ever be more terrifying than that. So, like, how dare you, how dare you imply that we are doing something dangerous when all we're doing is showing kids that the thing I said, how brave they are, that they can get through it. We put monsters in front of them, but we put a sword in their hands specifically so that they can see how monsters are fought, because like they're going to show up in their life one day. We all get monsters, and these books matter. And I just feel like it says a lot about the adults in the room and what they don't want to confront and what they don't want to deal with. When they say that like it's inappropriate for kids to be reading scary stories, because it's not.
Yeah. And the other thing that scary stories do is they allow kids to see that reading is fun.
Yes. Yes. Horror is fun.
And if you want them to be reading some of the other things that eventually they will find, get them reading a book that allows them to turn the pages and want to find out what's going to happen. So there is value to it. And it does not hurt a child to read something scary. Maybe they will go to bed and tell you that they had a nightmare. But you know what? Nightmares can happen whether you read books
Absolutely.
or not. So.
Absolutely. And the thing is, too, it's like when I think about it sometimes, because I always think about horror is like the opposite side of the same coin as funny. Like it uses tension to elicit a response. So in comedy, it's to laugh, and in horror, it's to gasp or like scream or be startled. But like, I feel like everyone has had those moments where like you go with your friends to see a horror movie and you both get so startled at the same moment that you start laughing because it's funny. It's funny.
Yes.
Like
there's a release.
Yes, it's fun and it's a release, and it's like no one would ever say that kid shouldn't read a comedy. And yet we're perfectly fine saying that kid shouldn't read a horror. And it's like, well, says who?
I'm on your side. I feel it. It's a battle.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, as an author, I don't have children. I have a niece and a nephew, but I just know the child that I was and what I needed. And I was an anxious kid.
Yeah.
I had a lot of fears. I did react to things that I saw and heard in my world. And there were times where I ran down the hallway screaming for mom and dad because, I thought there was a monster outside.
Yeah.
But we got through it.
And you know what? Honestly, I was an easily scared child. Like I was the kid that went to the sleepover and had to sit on the staircase when everybody watched like Freddy Krueger because it was too much for me. And then I had nightmares about him. And then I had nightmares about just the glove. And then I had nightmares that he was standing in the corner of the room. It's like my anxiety just went all over the place. So my mother, as moms are wont to do when they would like to sleep through the night and not have their child waking them up with nightmares, really worked very hard so that I wasn't exposed to horror. And all that did for me was make it more enticing. it made it so that I was the kid who went to the school library and would like sneak the copy of Scary Stories to Read in the Dark and like flip through it and like read 2 stories and then put it back on the shelf. Like it became a thing that I did in secret because it brought me comfort. And that's something I couldn't explain to her until I was an adult, doing what I'm doing now, which is exactly that, trying to bring comfort by showing kids that they will survive the night. So it's just funny how that worked out.
I want to talk a little bit about anxiety.
Yes.
As sort of displayed in the works of Poe. In The Telltale Heart in particular, we can talk about mental illness, mental, neurodivergence, anxiety, paranoia, which is all on display in The Telltale Heart. I feel like there is a connection between the Raven saying nevermore in The Raven and the pale blue eye that the narrator of Telltale Heart describes. They are almost like catalysts for an anxious mind to jump off the deep end.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Are you familiar with The Raven? Because I just reread that one again.
I am. I mean, I haven't read it in a bit, but the Raven, much like the Telltale Heart, really struck a chord with me when I first experienced it. And I think it's exactly what you were speaking to, which is this idea that a singular event that is ultimately harmless becomes a pivotal jumping point of like an anxiety spiral.
Yes.
It's this individual's eye. Like he murders someone because of their eye, like not because of anything that they did or anything like that. Just he doesn't like the look of this man's eye, so he's got to go. And it's the same. The Raven is just being a raven and squawking.
Yeah, and maybe he's saying nevermore. Maybe he's saying something that he learned or overheard because there is mimicry in Corvidae.
Yep.
Or maybe he's just squawking.
He's just squawking. And he hears...
The narrator hears nevermore.
Yep.
And it's the repetition of nevermore, the word nevermore that he thinks the Raven is saying, that sends him spiraling into not necessarily madness or anxiety, but just spiraling more into the grief they're feeling over the lost Lenore, the love. And I think that there's, in these characters, the narrator of the Raven and the narrator of the Telltale Heart, there is something behind the anxiety that they're feeling. And in the Raven, it could arguably be called grief. And in the Telltale Heart, I'm wondering what it is. And I want to mention something. I just watched a very, very short film by Robert Eggers. He did a short, the director of The Witch, which I also like to call The Vivitch, and and The Lighthouse. So he's dealing with psychological stuff in his work, but he adapted The Telltale Heart in 2009 as a 20-minute short film. Have you seen it?
I haven't, but now I'm going to go find it.
You must. It shows kind of what I'm talking about, the question that I'm asking of like, what is behind the anxiety? It shows the caretaker of this elderly man in this house. It shows his perception of the elderly man, who is portrayed almost like a Muppet. So like there is a puppet face, like very creepy, unreal, but it's clearly the person's perception of somebody who is elderly.
Okay.
And there's a moment where the caretaker, the narrator, there's no voiceover or anything like that. It's simply him observing as he goes through his daily routine with this elderly man. They don't even really have any dialogue, but you can see in the caretaker's eyes, there is either grief that the old man is decaying in front of him, or fear of his own mortality. And I'm not sure what it is, but it sort of touches on what I feel like Poe skillfully, inadvertently put into the story of this thing that is behind the anxiety. The reason that this person is obsessed with the pale blue eye and must eradicate that vulture eye that you mentioned, which I feel like is such a such a true indicator of anxiety. And I asked you before, we started the podcast if we could talk about anxiety in our own lives, as I've had a lot of it. And I'm not sure a lot of people really understand what anxiety truly
Yeah.
is. And I know from your own experiences that you've talked about publicly to the book that you wrote, or the second book that you wrote, the Disappearing House, that anxiety is a part of what you understand of the world. What was the quote that I wanted to read? I think it was from the first paragraph. This I felt was really true about anxiety as a trigger. He says, "The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad?"
Yep. Oh, God, it's so good.
Clearly, having looked back at Poe's life, he suffered a lot. A lot of death in his life, a lot of loss, and those are all triggers for having anxiety occur in your life.
I agree. I think that people who don't have what I'm going to specifically call acute anxiety don't understand exactly. Like, I feel like people, it's like the same way people don't fully understand depression, and they're like, well, just don't think about things that make you sad. And it's like, well, that's not how this works.
Yeah.
Don't be sad is not actually something I can do. And it's like,
Yeah.
when your anxiety is so significant that you are just in a constant state of dis-ease and a constant state of, I guess, like, it's more than just worry.
Hypervigilance.
Yes, hypervigilance. That's why his comment about hearing everything like nails it, because there's this oversensitivity, this like hyper sensory experience that you're going through that is overwhelmingly, I'm blanking on what the words I want to use are, but it's just, it becomes a thing where it's like you can't not be anxious anymore,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
in Disappearing House, like, I wrote about.
Yes, this is where I wanted to go.
So
I wanted you.
We can.
Can you tell
Yeah.
us about Disappearing
Sure.
House? Can you tell us the plot and tell us what this is about for you?
Okay, so Disappearing House is a story of a girl named Jack who is 12 years old and discovers that a house has just appeared overnight, seemingly appeared overnight, at the cul-de-sac where she rides her bike. And it coincides with the fact that Jack has been having some experiences that bring her and her mother to the fear that she's having a recurrence from a childhood cancer that she dealt with when she was 6 years old. So there's a couple falls from her bike, there's some shaking hands, there's some hallucinatory problems, and her mother gets very concerned. And so the point of the story is that her and her best friend Hazel get dared by some neighborhood bullies to go in the house, and they do, and then they find they can't leave. The door doesn't open up to the outside anymore. It becomes like a circular loop, and they just keep entering the same room. And so they're trapped in the house. And the point of the story is that Jack needs to face what she went through in order to get out of the house. It's a very much like the only way out is through kind of experience, that you have to dismantle and face your trauma. Like, it's not a cancer book, in the sense that word's only used once, but it's very much a book about the elasticity of trauma and managing when trauma snaps back at you, like it will do. Like, when you've been through something traumatic, it comes back around. It satellites
out of nowhere.
Sometimes. Right? With no like necessary trigger, it just can completely swoop back. And this, I wrote this story based upon my own experiences with having been diagnosed in my late 30s with cancer, which was extremely traumatic. Obviously, I'm fine. It's been almost 10 years now. But I still have those moments because I still have to go in for screenings and I still have to go get MRIs. And it's like, I still get put back into that headspace. One of the other themes about it that I talk about in the book is this notion of like, when you feel like the universe is signaled and picked you specifically, do you get, like, are you going to get what everybody gets? Like, have you been targeted? And what it's like to unlearn that feeling of I'm somehow uniquely, badly different than everybody else.
Mm.
I mean, and that all also ties into a degree of grief, and grief over you're not the person that you were before this experience happened, before you experienced this trauma, and you're a different person now, and that other person does need to be grieved, because you'll never be who you were before the trauma happened. And that needs to be faced and dealt with. Yeah, so that's this period.
I want to say my day job for a long time was working at Sloan Kettering Cancer Center.
Familiar.
And I worked in the outpatient clinics with the doctors running their clinics. I worked with the patients scheduling appointments. And then near the end, I was working in the chemotherapy units. So I worked very closely with the patients. And I know the anxiety that you're talking about specifically. There were moments of conversation that I had with people where I had to get other people involved. You know, there was, I mean, you could see the trauma happening in real time.
Yeah.
And I get it. I understand. And I understand where Disappearing House came from. I think it's a special book, and I think it's a necessary book. Absolutely deserved the Bram Stoker finalist tag that you can use for that now.
Thank you.
Incredible. So very, very important. And I'm just so glad and happy and proud that you were able to use your experience and create something from it, something terrifying and true and healing for a lot of people who I know need this book. So,
Thank you. That means a lot to me. I do feel, I never, the thing about Disappearing, like I'm very proud of this book. I'm always very honored when people talk about their reaction to it, especially when they're like, well, I didn't go through that specific thing, but I know that house. Like, I have my own trauma house. And I'm like, yeah.
Oh,
okay.
I know that house.
Yeah, I know that house. I've been stuck in that house too.
That's incredible.
And that really is meaningful to me, because I wrote the book. So after I was diagnosed, I wrote a book of poems called Better Luck Next Year. That was all about like what I went through. And I was like, okay, dealt with that, moving along. And I wrote other stuff. I wrote Ghost Girl. I knew I wanted to do a haunted house story. And I started thinking about like, well, what haunted houses are typically metaphors for, like a diseased mind. And I was like, well, what if it was a diseased body? And I was like, oh, you have things you still want to talk about, don't you? Okay, let's do this. I never really thought it was ever going to be a real book. Like, I felt like when I finished it, I was like, okay, you wrote that for you. You gave Jack a story that feels true to what you went through. And that's all it ever has to be. And it will just live as a file on my computer. And, I was talking to my friend Amber McBride about it, and we shared an agent, and she was like, no, I think you need to send this. And I was like, really? Because it just feels like it's too Ally. It's too specific. She's like, it's not. From that, she wound up writing a book that just came out last year, I think, called We Are All So Good at Smiling, which I highly recommend, which is about her struggles with depression. And like, single-handedly, like we've talked about this many times, was like, because you wrote Disappearing House, I was like, oh, I can also write about my trauma. And I just think that these books are really important. So, it's the windows and mirrors thing. It's the, like, kids need to see that representation for themselves, but they also need to see it to know that there are other kids who are going through something like this. Like, for every Jack, there is a Hazel. There is the best friend who's like, wait, what happened? Like, you never told me.
Yeah.
Like,
you never told
me.
Right.
Like, I'm your friend. Like, I want to be there for you, and I think that those are both really two important experiences that kids get exposed to, because Trauma happens to children. They're still living through a pandemic. Global warming is real. Like, these things are significant, and they have to face them. And I just think that we can give them the tools to do that.
Yeah, so it's a delicate balance about talking about these things, trauma, anxiety, with young people. I had an experience the year that my first book came out, and I wonder if the anticipation and the anxiety of The Stone Child coming out and everything that leads up to publication, all of your expectations, that was when I kind of had my moment of acute anxiety. Yeah. A note that I wrote down in the Telltale Heart was obsession creates illusion.
Oh,
yeah. And I want to mention this one weird little thing that I sort of feel like ties into that little passage, the quote that I read about sensory experience, and how you can see and hear things, and from heaven all the way down to hell, and feel things in our bodies. I had this strange, along with the mental stuff, which was obsession, I would hyper focus on something that I was feeling physically, in a way that, like what I was saying earlier about Nevermore and the pale blue eye, like there was anxiety in me, but the anxiety forced me to look at one thing very, very closely. And what it was for me, strangely, was this burning sensation on the tip of my left index finger.
Interesting.
Like, if I think about it, I can feel it right now. There is nothing wrong with my index finger.
Right.
I know that now.
Right.
But at the time, my brain couldn't stop thinking about it. It was my pale blue eye. Yep. It was my Nevermore. And what I learned to do was laugh about it. And that was my way through that experience of strange little physicality. Right. Whenever I feel it now, I call it my stress finger. It's because I know that I'm feeling stressed. Yep. And whatever it is, either it's a cycle of the anxiety is making the thing feel like it's on fire, or the physical stress of my body is manifesting in that pain, and my brain is pointing at it as a problem. So I know the cycle now. I know it. I can laugh at it, and I have to laugh at it, or else I'm going to obsess about it.
Yeah.
And that's what anxiety feels like for me in a lot of ways. That's the minimum of what anxiety feels like for me. It's been interesting to explore Edgar Allan Poe, who clearly was going through a lot of things. Yeah. Had some anxiety, had a lot of grief, depression, loss. And I feel very lucky that my life is nothing like Edgar Allan Poe's. I have my support network. I have the people in my life that like you said, Jack had Hazel, and I know that I can talk to them about the things that I need to talk to about. And I think books can kind of act as that connection too. Like, whether or not you yourself, Ally Malinenko, is there in the room with the person who is reading your book, you are there with them, and you are that connection to another human.
Yeah. It's the whole empathy thing, It's truly like the power of storytelling is how we understand what it is to be human. And I just feel like horror, more than any other kind of storytelling, really digs the deepest into what it is to be human, because I think fear is so primary and so unavoidable. I always think of fear as like fear offers no middle ground. Like, either you succumb to it or you conquer it. Those are your only options. There's no halfway point when it comes to fear. Like, you are either,
oh my God, you're so right.
Yes, you're either going to get over it or you're never going to get over it. And that's it. Like, those are your only options, and I think that the universality of horror allows for us to explore what that really means. It's just the opportunity to be like, hey, this is a thing that I experienced and felt. Does anyone know what else this feels like? And then someone on the other side of the world is like, oh, I totally know that. I understand that. I feel that way too. And then you're like, oh, good. I'm being a human a little bit better. Like I'm humaning
Yeah.
as best as possible right
I'm
now.
human.
Yeah. And I think that's really important. And I think that what Poe's work does really speaks to the darkest aspects of anxiety. The fixation, the aggressive thought process when you can't stop fixating on something like your stress finger, and then the complicated work of getting through grief, because a lot of his work also is very much, obviously, like we talked about with The Raven, is very much about managing grief. So yeah, I just think it's such a rich format for understanding the human experience in all of its greatness and in all of its monstrosity.
And it is a good gateway, I think, for a 6th grader, a 7th grader, maybe a 5th grader, maybe a 4th grader. I don't know about putting a kid in a pit in 3rd grade, but
it happened. It happened. And I'm here to tell the tale.
Yes, so to speak. Tell Ally. So speaking of which, Ally, can you tell our listeners what's up next for you? Do you have any secrets, or are you allowed to spill?
I can spill. So my next middle grade book is coming out in summer 2025. So it's about 2 years, which feels like forever, but it's not, because I actually still have to write it. Whoopsie. But yeah, so that is called Broken Dolls, and it's with HarperCollins, still same editor. And Broken Dolls is a story about grief, where the dolls are the metaphor for this notion that if you weren't real, you don't have to die. And therefore, the idea that life is only powerful and special and important because it ends. And this very much was stemmed from in 21 when my father passed, and then this past summer I lost my mom. So I'm very much sorry. Oh, thank you. Remember when I said it's been a bad summer?
Yeah.
I very much am going through the grief process as I'm writing this grief book. So this has been an interesting time, but I think it's good because I can dismantle my feelings, and that's exactly what I did with Disappearing House. So yeah, so I'm working on that, and then I have an adult book coming out that is not horror, also in 25, which is called The Other March Sisters, which is I co-wrote with some friends, where we each took one of the characters in Little Women and basically told the story from their point of view to kind of undo what I refer to as like the Jonas because Jo gets so much character and her sisters are a little bit cardboard. And we wanted to bring them to life. And I wrote, because of course I did, I wrote the section on Beth, who is the sick girl, to give her a context where she's more than just the sick girl. So,
yes.
Yeah, that was my whole point. I gave her a story that is not about her dying. And I'm very proud of this story, and I'm very excited that it'll be out in 25 also. So yeah, so those are some of the things I'm working on.
Well, congratulations. Well, they both sound magnificent. I'm just wondering, I just wanted to ask, like, were you tempted to put some horror into Little Women?
Yes, and I did. And when my
Little Women Vampire Slayer, something like that. I don't know.
I have this like whole section where Beth, if your listeners aren't familiar with the story, Beth contracts the fever that eventually kills her from bringing food to this family called the Hummels, and the baby is sick and she holds the baby and the baby dies. And in my story, Beth sees that baby everywhere, like sitting with her dolls, like in her bedroom. She like is haunted essentially by what happened to that child and what she knows is happening to her. So it definitely, like, because when my friends who co-wrote it with me read it, they were like, only you would have turned Beth March into a horror story. And I was like, listen, terrible things happen. I don't know. I like talking about them.
it makes sense to me,
Yeah.
you know,
I mean,
and it would have, I think
drama.
it would have made sense to Poe.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think this is a good place to end.
Okay.
And I just, did you have anything else that you wanted to add, or?
No, this has been a great conversation. I'm so excited to be here. This was so much fun.
Yeah, well, I so appreciate you taking the time to do this, and hopefully we get to chat sometime soon. I
I
can't wait to
hope
read your new
so.
stuff.
Thank you. You too.
I'm so glad Ally agreed to talk about all those personal things. I feel like it was necessary in order to reach the heart of what we were examining about Edgar Allan Poe. And also, for listening to my own stories. What Ally said about empathy and horror makes a lot of sense to me, and Ally is certainly one of the most empathetic authors I know. Please check out This Appearing House. In a way, it seems to be in close conversation with some of Poe's work, which not only speaks to the indelible timeless quality of The Telltale Heart and The Raven, but also to Ally's own writing passions. Please subscribe to Our First Fears wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like, you can follow our social media at Our First Fears, one word, on the site formerly known as Twitter, as well as on Instagram. You can also reach out at ourfirstfears@gmail.com. If you do want to get in touch, let me know. How does the sound of a beating heart make you feel deep, deep down? Thanks again for your precious time. I'm Dan Poblocki, wishing you sweet dreams and pleasant nightmares.